Hello and welcome back to How to Be a Better DM. My name is Caden Otley and I'm going to be your host. And today I'm going to be talking about the art of foreshadowing, planting seeds for big reveals. So we're going to be diving into one of the most exciting tools in a Dungeon Master's toolkit, foreshadowing. It is the secret sauce that transforms a decent campaign into a masterpiece, really allowing you to create those, oh crap moments for your players that they will never ever forget. So, why does foreshadowing even matter? Foreshadowing, like I said, sets up these epic payoffs. They make your story feel cohesive. Even if you've been kind of BSing it from the very beginning, if you're planting these little seeds to kind of your overall story arc and your plan, then as your players hit those moments, things really start to feel real. And they also keep your players guessing throughout the entire campaign. So let's get into it. So what is foreshadowing? Foreshadowing is planting hints or clues about future events in your story. Think of it like you're leaving breadcrumbs leading to some kind of a big revelation. There are really two types of foreshadowing. There's direct foreshadowing, which is something like a prophecy or an NPC warning players outright. For example, in the campaign that I just finished up with my group, I had an oracle, and the oracle touched one of the players, and that player was able to prophesy at different times depending on how she rolled or different things that she did. And so that would be an example of direct foreshadowing, something that I want the players to know that is in their immediate future. And then the second type is subtle foreshadowing. And so these are more, background details, little motifs, or offhand remarks. It could be something that an NPC mentions, but it's some in passing. Or I, for example, in that same campaign had some clues that were kind of left in books, or even letters to a player from somebody in their backstory, warning them about a sort of danger, but this person, my player didn't know that, this danger would actually immediately come to affect them. It was more like a, hey, watch out, like this is kind of something that's happening back home, and it ended up happening later in the campaign for him. So that's subtle foreshadowing. Okay, part 2. So how do we use foreshadowing in Dungeons and Dragons? So this is obviously the meat and the potatoes of the whole thing. How can we practically put this in a way that feels organic? So I like to plan the big reveal first if I'm able to. And, with Dungeons and Dragons, you have to realize that your players are going to throw you a lot of curveballs, and so it might not come out when you anticipate it to, but I guarantee it, they will eventually present a time when it becomes, it's like the perfect opportunity. So decide what you're foreshadowing. So is it, a villain's true identity, a major betrayal, which is one of my favorites? Maybe you have an NPC that they have come to trust and, ends up stabbing them in the back at the right moment. Or is it an artifact's hidden power, something that they've been carrying with them that they didn't truly understand, but maybe there were hints as to how powerful this object really was? It might be a good idea to write down 3 to 5 clues that you can kind of weave into the narrative as you're playing. So these can be little things that an NPC might say, or, if in the case of like a betrayal, maybe it's, little kind of odd things that this person who's going to betray them is doing that might lead some of the group to mistrust that person. Again, in my most recent campaign, one of my players, I think they cast detection of good and evil on this NPC that was actually not good, not really evil, but definitely had his own his own goals for where he was leading them, wanted to steal something from the party. And this caused some kind of a rift in the group, and it was made for some really interesting role playing. And also, when it kind of came out that this guy was bad, some of the other players you could see were noticeably disappointed that they weren't the ones to catch it first, and like, oh, I should have believed so and so. So that made for a really fun reveal. Let's see. The next thing after planning is trying to layer these hints in naturally. So I talked about this before, using NPC dialogue or little environmental details or recurring symbols might be a good idea, just because then your players start to it's hard to remember everything from a previous session, and so having these things kind of pop up over and over again shows your players that it's important, and then also kind of trains their mind to be looking for those things. An example of this could be like an NPC muttering something like, oh, this place feels cursed, while passing a forest. And, later there is something in the forest that ties it to like a corrupted fae or something along those lines. And that's obviously a lame example, but you get the idea. The last part of this, using foreshadowing practically is try to mix in some red herrings with the real clues. So this is good, because otherwise your players start to treat everything you say as the DM as law, and if they're doing that, eventually you have to learn how to shut up. You have to learn how to not give away plot points. But if you're always just kind of saying stuff and maybe the storyline or the plot isn't super clear, the plot that you want them to take, the path that you want them to take, then they really start to mistrust you a little bit and take the story into their own hands, which I appreciate. So you can do this by including kind of irrelevant details. That's a good way to kind of throw your players off from the scent a little bit, especially if they're kind of really catching on. Or again, in my most recent campaign, one of my players is kind of beholden to this god as a paladin, and their god was giving them visions about this very powerful artifact and bringing it to the mountain. And once the players found the artifact, this specific player, the paladin, was intent on bringing it to the mountain and didn't really second guess it. Just thought, well, if this is the path that my god wants me to take, then it must be a good one. And there were a lot of indicators kind of as they had gone throughout that made the rest of the group mistrust this specific deity. And as it turned out, it caused the destruction of the material plane as they knew it, causing kind of the second arc. So the red herring, or the different paths that you can lead them on, the different kinds of foreshadowing, can actually end up being negative things that entice your players to keep playing. Now my players have a real reason to jump back into the second arc, and hopefully they'll be a lot more engaged than in the first. Part 3 of this whole foreshadowing series is kind of more practical tips for foreshadowing. My first one is make it player driven. Definitely drop hints when players are actively investigating or asking questions. As well as just when they're not, but definitely when they are, because you want to provide them with this information when they're actively engaged. So an example of this is, when they're maybe searching a ruined temple, they find carvings showing the rise of the god they'll face later. They're much more likely to remember that, because it's something, they're asking you to investigate, kind of imagining these things in their minds, and that is bound to stick out to them. Another thing you can do is, evolve these hints. So, for example, maybe you have a deity in your game called the Stormcaller, And there's kind of this vague mention of the Stormcaller as a passing legend in the very beginning of the campaign. But the second time they see it or they come across this name, it's maybe a sailor's tattoo that they point out, and he tells them, oh, it's the Stormcaller. And the third time, the players hear a warning. The Stormcaller is rising. Maybe this is, from another NPC, or maybe from, the Oracle, something like that. The foreshadowing is kind of getting more and more intense every single time you end up dropping this hint, showing them that, it's obviously something that needs their attention, and it, expands the importance of it. So the last thing is on this part is don't overdo it. In every detail is a hint, and players might, easily become overwhelmed or distracted. And so if you feel like your characters are really kind of getting away from where you wanted them to be, then, you can kind of pull it back, or even on your session recaps in the next session, you can kind of just drop details that you don't want them to remember. And so that way that it doesn't become too much of a problem. So the next part of this is some more examples. I think it's important to kind of have these as, maybe as I'm talking about them, you can use them in your campaign as inspiration. First example is maybe the players are in a tavern and they hear an NPC humming an eerie tune. Later, this tune matches a melody that they hear in a cursed temple. Second example, a merchant's wares are marked with a strange sigil. Months later, the sigil ends up belonging to the villain's organization. They're going to want to go back and investigate that merchant and probably find out where he purchased those things. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in today's episode is just kind of quick tips for the table. So make sure at your table that you're keeping notes for continuity. And of course, this applies to a whole range of topics, but especially your foreshadowing, and especially when, it's on the fly, because sometimes my foreshadowing is made up, when my players are kind of guessing at what I'm trying to get to. It's like, oh yeah, that's actually a great idea, or I bet I could spin that to my advantage in some way. And so I have to write that down because it wasn't in my notes, or a part of my original plan. So yeah, definitely be, kind of keeping notes for this continuity, and, maybe in like a flow chart, especially for those evolving foreshadowing tips. And again, on player speculation, encourage this. When your players start guessing, just be quiet and listen, because it might inspire you to, come up with a new plot point, or just improve your foreshadowing overall. If they're really grabbing onto an idea and they're fascinated by it, then it might be a really good idea to dive deeper into it and come up with something that is going to blow their minds. And then, of course, this is maybe one of the best Dungeon Master tips, is just be flexible. So if a player misses a clue, just, don't be afraid to reintroduce it in a later, maybe a different form. Well, thank you for tuning into today's episode. I'm just going to do a quick kind of recap of everything that I talked about. So first one is plan your big reveals first. Second is layer your clues in naturally and subtly. Third is use repetition, but don't overdo it too much to the point where you're overwhelming your characters. So now I challenge you, think about your current campaign. What moments could you foreshadow starting today? Feel free to drop us a message with your ideas. Join our Discord and have a chat with us there. We talk about these kind of things all the time and love to brainstorm about your sessions. And if it's something especially cool, maybe we could even feature it in a future episode, kind of talk about the plot and how we could really push the foreshadowing in it. Anyway, thanks again for tuning in to How to Be a Better DM, and we'll see you next week.
Brought to you by Session Zero Studios. For more information, visit sessionzerostudios.com.